don't you love having those projects where you work on something all week and you think you got what you want to do, and then it changes? Right near the end, right when you're supposed to do that. That was me last night. And so lots of things are changing, or we're changing for today's message. But this one's looking at Exodus 13 through 17, this Torah portion, and looking at the patterns and the songs that are in here. Because even before you get to the final three plagues, the locust, the darkness, the death of the firstborn and such, they're leaving Egypt. We talked about this a couple weeks ago. Their leaving Egypt seemed to correspond in some way to a feast. You see that back in chapter 10, Exodus 10:8. It says, "So Moses and Aaron were brought to Pharaoh again. He says, 'Go and serve Adonai your God,' he said, 'but who will be going?'" Remember, this was all in that concept of Pharaoh of the world still trying to control God's people and say, okay, we'll let you do a little bit, but we're still going to try to keep you restrained from fully obeying God. And Moses answered, "We will be going with our young and our elderly, our sons and our daughters. We will go with our flocks and our herds, for we must have Adonai's feast for him." Again, so that's saying that when they're about to leave, it's corresponding to a feast day, because does Moses get to pick when the feasts are? Can they just walk out and say, "Hey, everybody, we're having a feast for the Lord"? No. We don't get to pick those times. Those were times that were set up all the way back in Genesis chapter 1 with the creation of the sun, moon, and stars. Those were all there, put in place to help the people of God identify the times and the seasons, the feast days, and such as that. Not just talking about the weather. Those were put there to identify when God wants to meet with his people. That's the pattern that God has set up from the beginning. And it's a pattern that he acts, he operates throughout history, with his people. He operates consistent with his feasts. And so Moses is saying, we've got to go out and have an Adonai's feast for him. And so to get us used to looking on those days is really what the feasts are supposed to be about. He wants us looking for important events, important things on his calendar that are going to happen consistent with these days, with these feast days. And so he has us celebrating something on a weekly basis, on a monthly basis, on a yearly cycle. That's how he operates. He says, pay attention to these feast days that I have set up, because I'm going to be working on those days. If you remember what Chag, what that means. You hear the words Chag Sameach or different other things. The feast, it's the festival. It's from Chagag, which means to observe, a festival, to march in a sacred procession. So it's not just individual, but it's a whole group that are coming together. It also means to celebrate or dance. But it also means to move in a circle. And so it's that repeating element of life and things of that sort. And God, he operates with this in mind, with this principle. He operates in these repeated cycles. He gives an event, a moment, to foreshadow something you're going to see it again. It's going to come later. And so when you study, when you look at the scriptures, the more you know the first event, the more you're going to start recognizing the pattern. And you're going to see it again later. So it's not a foolproof method, that the more you study the first events that you'll understand everything that's going to happen later. I mean, obviously, even the Israelite people missed some things in studying the feasts and such. But God teaches, he prepares his people through this kind of repetition, this repeated cycle of feast days. Passover, this time in Exodus where we've been reading and studying about, is an immediate example of that, because the story of redemption is played out in front of everybody. And for this work of Messiah to cover our sins, Genesis 22 is another one of those kind of moments at the binding of Isaac, how the father is willing to offer his only son whom he loves on the altar. The weekly Shabbat is another one of those reminders of him, and it foreshadows the rest that is to come, that is promised. And so even when you look at the yearly feasts as a whole, that whole cycle tells the story of redemption and the kingdom. The redemption, what it costs, what it means, and the kingdom that is to come, and the life that we will live. And we read some of these passages earlier, but in 1 Corinthians, Paul, he lists this series of events from biblical history. And a lot of them come out of this week's Torah portion, this week's section in these chapters of Exodus. Chapter 10, verse 1, he says, "For I do not want you to be ignorant, brothers and sisters, that our fathers were all under the cloud and all passed through the sea. They were all immersed into Moses in the cloud and in the sea, and all ate the same spiritual food, and all drank the same spiritual drink, for they were drinking from a spiritual rock that followed them, and the rock was Messiah." All right, so we talked about this before. All of them were supposed to be participating in this. The cloud and the sea, the food that comes up in this Torah portion, the drink, the water that comes up in this Torah portion, and such as that. He says, nevertheless, and Paul is referring to these events for a reason. God was not pleased with most of them, for they were struck down in the desert. Now these things happened as examples for us. Here they are. They're 1,000+ years removed from those actual events, and those are still supposed to be important for them. They're still supposed to be able to learn something from them. These were examples for us, so we wouldn't crave evil things just as they did. He says, "Do not be idolaters, as some of them were. As it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play." And he goes on, and he says, "And let us not commit sexual immorality, as some of them did. And in one day 23,000 of them fell. And let us not test the Lord, as some of them did, and were destroyed by the serpents. And let us not grumble, as some of them did, and were destroyed by the destroying angel." Okay? Paul is using these references, right, to teach these important issues, these important lessons about grumbling, about craving evil things, about testing the Lord and immorality and such like that. But don't you see, he kind of assumes that his readers knows what he's talking about. He kind of assumes, he doesn't tell you what chapter and verse to find it in, right? He assumes that his readers, both Jew and Gentile, were familiar enough with these stories, with these accounts, to instruct them, to warn them, to prepare them, to prevent his readers from taking part in certain things. Now, how many of y'all hear these kind of things preached on most Sunday mornings or most times? Usually we don't cover those things. We don't go back and go to the original story. We don't go back to we have a vague understanding, but we don't always talk about the lessons. Passing through the Red Sea, following the cloud by day and night, eating the manna, drinking the water from the rock. All of these things were serving as examples for Paul's current generation. And those are also means that are helpful things for us to learn those lessons as well. Verse 11 goes on to say, "These things happened to them as an example, and it was written down as a warning to us, on whom the ends of the ages have come." Now let me ask y'all, those issues that he brought up, that he was trying to teach from, do the people of God still struggle with those issues? All of them. Across the board, we still struggle with each of those issues. We still need those examples from the scriptures, from the life of Moses and the Israelites. We still need those to teach us. We still need to hear those warnings. And let me ask you, it says, these are examples and warnings on those whom the ends of the ages have come. Who's closer to the end of the ages, Paul in his day or us in our day? That would be us. We're closer to the end of the ages than they are. And since we are closer, then they are even more necessary. Because those kind of issues are going to be increasing all the more as the day approaches. So basically what he's saying is, guys, our lives should change. We should heed these lessons. We should know these lessons as we read, as we meditate over, and as we participate in these stories. You know, it's to me, it's no accident that all of these examples that Paul lists in 1 Corinthians come from the Torah in one of the most pivotal moments in Israel's history, the Exodus. Something that they were supposed to relive every year. Something they were supposed to put themselves into the story every year when their lives were completely changed. The nation was completely changed at this time. You know, they moved from slavery to freedom. They were redeemed. They moved from darkness to light. They moved from not having the commands of God to having the Torah of God. So it's no accident that he would refer to events connected to the Exodus, connected to the spring feasts, like the Passover, like unleavened bread. It's no wonder that he referred to those things in particular in this section, in this area of Scripture, because Paul had already encouraged the Corinthians, even the Gentiles, to keep the feasts, to keep unleavened bread, back in chapter 5. You know, where he says, you know, get rid of the old chametz, the old yeast, so that you may be a new batch, just as you are unleavened. For Messiah, our Passover lamb, has been sacrificed. He expects them to know what he's talking about when he says these things. And so therefore he says, let us celebrate the feasts. Not with the old chametz, the chametz of malice and wickedness, but with unleavened bread, the matzah of sincerity and truth. You know, his argument, his instruction to the Corinthians only makes sense when his readers actually keep the feasts. For then, that's how they learn the lesson of what it takes to get the leaven out of your house, how to get the chametz out of your life. They learn the lesson through the practice and through the cycle, through the celebration, through that Chag of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the Feast of Passover. So they only learn the lessons from chapter 10 as they become more and more familiar with the events and come to understand their connection to them, even thousands of years removed as the people of God, as they themselves are redeemed from slavery, as they themselves are still awaiting the fullness of the kingdom. In other words, it's those who participate in the Chag, the cycle of God's instructions through the feast. Those people are the ones who are better prepared for those last days, the end of the ages, as it said. As the end of the ages approaches ever nearer, it's through the celebration and the keeping of the feast that we have a better idea of what's coming and what our part is supposed to be in all of those things, because we as the people of God are not supposed to be in the dark about what's happening. That's 1 Thessalonians 5. He says, now concerning the times and the seasons, brothers and sisters, you have no need for anything to be written to you. For you yourselves know very well that the day of the Lord comes like the thief in the night. Concerning the times and the seasons, so is he talking about your wristwatch and the weather? The time, the clock. He's not talking about what we think of, what comes to our mind It's a phrase that is really speaking of these days of fulfillment. These days when God, His plan and His purpose begin to unfold before you. That's what He's talking about. So when all of His plans begin to take shape and He sets things in motion on earth, and Paul refers to that as similar. Oh, well, I'll go on. For you yourselves know very well that the day of the Lord comes like a thief in the night. He says in verse 4, he says, but you brothers and sisters are not in the dark, so that the day might overtake you like a thief. Right? For you are all sons of light and sons of day. We are not of the night or of the darkness. So when His plans begin to take shape, He sets things in motion like He does in Galatians. But when the fullness of time came, and the Complete Jewish Bible translated says, when the appointed time arrived, God sent out His Son, born of a woman, born under the law, under the Torah, to free those under the law, so we might receive the adoption as sons. Right? When God begins to move and begins to act in this world to set about His plans and His things being fulfilled, they are coinciding with the feasts. And looking at 1 Thessalonians again, he says some important things. Again, concerning the times and seasons. It says this strange thing, you have no need for anything to be written to you, for you yourselves know very well that the day of the Lord comes like a thief in the night. That's interesting. I don't need to write to you anything, because you know very well. They know something important. They know that the day of the Lord will come like a thief. And they seem to know this without Paul writing and explaining it all in this book of Thessalonians. He doesn't have to write it down for them. Now, most of us probably would not know that the day of the Lord will come like a thief if Paul hadn't written it right here. Right? How else would we know that? Where else would we be taught that? But Paul's readers, he expects them already to know that. And they didn't have just a vague inkling of it. Somehow they know it very well. Right? That word knowledge is not what I was expecting it to be, but it's oida, which means to know, to get knowledge of, understanding, or perceive. And this one I thought was interesting. This is one of those Strong's definitions. The force and meaning of something which has a definite meaning. You're coming to this knowledge of something which is defined, something which is important. And it comes from, it's a variation of eido, which means to see, to perceive by any of the senses, to pay attention, to observe, or to experience any state or condition. Now what's interesting, what is it about the feasts, especially when you think of Passover? How are you taught? How do you learn in keeping the Passover? Is it just with your ears only? Is it just with your eyes only? What else does it include? It includes the smell, it includes taste, it includes touch, it includes any and all of the senses are built in to the keeping of something like Passover. That's what's amazing. How would Paul's readers already have this knowledge if he didn't need to write it to them? When you look in the book of Acts at chapter 17, that's when he's in Thessalonica. What's interesting there is we're told that he was only in Thessalonica for a little over 3 Sabbaths, so about 3 weeks, before persecution forced him to move on. Now, how many of y'all think you can get a full and complete grasp of end times prophecy in about 3 weeks, and you've never heard it before? Anybody want to jump in for that one and say, oh yeah, I'm a master. 3 weeks, I know it all. And these believing Thessalonians were mostly Gentile. Could Paul really have imparted such a knowledge in 3 weeks that they would be so comfortable and so familiar with the end times that to know that the day of the Lord come like a thief, that he really has, I don't need to tell you about that, you got that, you know it. How would they come to know the times and the seasons about the day of the Lord so well? The answer is in chapter 4 of Thessalonians. You know, he had just been saying in chapter 5 about how you're not in the dark. But you look back in chapter 4, and guess what? He refers to another feast. Now, we do not want you to be uninformed, brothers and sisters, about those who are asleep, so that you may not grieve like the rest who have no hope. For if we believe that Yeshua died and rose again, so with him God will also bring those who have fallen asleep in Yeshua. For this we tell you by the word of the Lord, that we who are alive and remain until the coming of the Lord shall in no way precede those who are asleep. For the Lord himself shall come down from heaven with a commanding shout, with the voice of the archangel and the blast of God's shofar. And the dead in Messiah shall rise first. That commanding shout, the feast Yom Teruah is what is known as the day of blowing or shouting or trumpets. All of those elements are right in here. All of them are right in there. These passages, they bring up a lot of things. That's how he means, how he intends to communicate the concepts. He uses the language of the fall feasts, the feasts that communicate the return of Yeshua, events that are foreshadowed in the Feast of Trumpets. So what he's getting at is Paul's readers know all of these things, know about the second coming, know about the resurrection, because they know, they experience, they participate in the feasts on a yearly cyclical basis. They know the Feast of Trumpets, what it means, what it foreshadows, what it communicates about the return, about the kingdom, about the coming of Messiah ben David. And so they are sons and daughters of the light. They are not in the dark because they participate in that cycle, the Chag of the feasts of the Lord that communicate his plans and his purposes. That's what they are for. And I say all of that about the feast because it brings us to these moments here in Exodus chapter 13 through 17. Because not only do the Jewish people read this account, during a weekly Torah portion at some point, but they essentially reenacted and participated on a yearly basis during the Passover. So they get it at least minimum twice a year. And the Exodus, as you know, is one of the most defining elements of the Jewish people and the Jewish experience. And that was true in Yeshua's day, and it's still largely true today. And this portion opens just after the events of the Exodus night. He says, after Pharaoh had let the people go. Right? So after those things, after the slaying of the firstborn, after the slaying of the lambs and the putting of the blood over the doorposts, after those things, after Pharaoh had let the people go, God did not lead them along the road to the land of the Philistines, although that was nearby, for God said the people might change their minds if they see war and return to Egypt. So God led the people around by way of the wilderness to the Sea of Reeds, and Bnei Israel went up out of the land of Egypt armed, or in ranks, in order. And as you read this portion, throughout this portion, we see Pharaoh, in pursuit of the people of God, where he gathers and brings all of his best troops that he had left. His best chariots, his horses, his captains, because he thought that the Israelites, man, these guys, they have no idea what they're doing. They have no idea where they're going. Pharaoh was under the delusion that he could, after taking such a beating, after the Egyptians took such a beating during the plagues for the last year or so, he actually was under the idea that he could attack the people of God and actually win. I mean, why else would he be going after them? And it's important to know that he was not coming after them to recapture them. He was not coming after them to bring them back to Egypt. He was coming to mow them down and to kill them all. But instead of victory, as we read in this portion, Pharaoh once again is put in his place. And there shouldn't be any doubt about this. But neither Pharaoh nor even really the Israelites understood just how great and awesome God truly is. Believers and unbelievers still didn't quite understand what exactly was being said about God and His exaltedness, as His power and His might. That's why it says those phrases, I will harden Pharaoh's heart so he will follow after them. Then I will be glorified over Pharaoh along with all his army, and the Egyptians will know. He's trying to settle the issue of who is God and who is in charge. The Egyptians will know that I am Adonai. Verse 12, the Israelites themselves had this struggle. Did we not say to you in Egypt, let us alone, so that we may serve the Egyptians? It was better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness. Did they know yet how great and awesome God is? Apparently not. But Moses said to the people, do not be afraid. Stand still and see the salvation of Adonai, which he will perform for you today. You have seen the Egyptians today, but you will never see them again, ever. He says, Adonai will fight for you while you hold your peace. So God is doing this so that the Egyptians will see it. He is doing all of this so that the Israelites will see it. And so then we get to witness, the pillar of cloud and fire. We get to witness the parting of the Red Sea with, walls of water on both sides. We get to see Pharaoh in his bloodlust charge in after them and drown. Right? You're supposed to come to these readings and these reenactments of Passover. You're supposed to come to these things when you go through those feasts. You're supposed to come and ask the kind of questions. What was he thinking? How is it possible that Pharaoh could be so crazy as to try to attack God's people after everything that he's been through, after everything that he's seen? Why would he be so nuts as to think that he could win? That's madness. He's got to know that he's going to lose. But then you also need to ask the question, after all that they've seen, how can the Israelites not trust God to deliver them from Pharaoh and his armies? That's also madness. That's also crazy. How could they not believe him yet after what they've seen? How can they continue to question him? How can they continue to doubt him? To think that he doesn't care? To think that he can't provide? How can they grumble and complain against him? Those are the exact same questions that believers are supposed to ask of themselves. Because how can I? How can I continue to question him? How can I continue to doubt him? How can I continue to think that he doesn't care? How can I continue to think that he can't provide for me? How can I continue to grumble and complain against them? And we're supposed to ask those kinds of questions of ourselves, especially as we we read the book of Revelation. Because what do we see happening in the book of Revelation? going big picture, general here. There is a character in the book of Revelation that's a whole lot like Pharaoh in cosmic history. He tries to set up his own kingdom. He tries to exalt himself over the Most High, and he receives a beatdown of epic proportions. Not just in the beginning, but also, at the arrival of Messiah, when the resurrection destroys any hint of victory he thought he might have had. And in spite of all of that, after those beatdowns that he's already received, delusion and hardness of heart remains to the point that before it's all over, as these end of days approaches, he gathers whatever army remains, his best chariots, his best horses, his captains, to chase after the people of God. Does this not sound familiar? To make one last rush to cut them down, thinking that in this way he may just yet win. And it's madness. It's madness on Satan's part. The madness of Pharaoh is a picture of the madness of Satan in Revelation. That's why the Song of Moses is brought up. When you look at Exodus chapter 15, it's that chapter, the Song of Moses. But it's there also in Revelation chapter 15. Oh, this is not supposed to be there. Revelation 15, verse 3. And they are singing the song of Moses, the servant of God, and the song of the Lamb. Now we get to hear more of the lyrics of the song of the Lamb. Great and wonderful are your deeds, Adonai Elohai Tsabaoth. Just and true are your ways, O King of the nations. Who shall not fear and glorify your name, O Lord? For you alone are holy. All the nations shall come and worship before you, for your righteous acts have been revealed. This is when you get to see everything come to happen the way it's always been talked about, always been foreshadowed, always been anticipated. And so we get to see these moments where God reveals His glory, where there is no nation that stands against Him, where every nation will come and worship. So what does the Song of Moses tell us that should give God's people comfort in Revelation? Why are they singing that song at the time of the end? The first thing is, we see it just in the first couple of verses in Exodus 15, is, God is almighty. Don't ever doubt that. And He fights for His people. Then Moses and Bnei Israel sang this song to Adonai. I will sing to Adonai, for He is highly exalted. The horse and its rider He has thrown into the sea. Adonai is my strength and song, and He has become my salvation. And what's that word, salvation? Yeshua. Right? This is my God, and I will glorify Him. My Father's God, and I will exalt Him. And then, verse 3, Adonai is a warrior. Adonai is His name. God is almighty, and He fights for His people. That's a lesson don't we need to know that in the book of Revelation? When all the end times things start happening, when all the world is in chaos, we never need to forget that truth. That the Lord is a warrior, the Lord is His name. He fights for His people. He goes on, talking about His greatness. He says, who is like you, Adonai? This is verse 11. Among the gods, who is like you, glorious in holiness, awesome in praises, doing wonders? There is nobody else like Him. No matter what anybody else tries to say, no matter what is happening at the end times that might make you question it, there is no one like Him. And it also goes on, after trying to establish who God is, how awesome and how great He is, and how He fights for His people, it also goes on to describe the madness and the relentlessness of the enemy who attacks God and his purpose. This is also in the Song of Moses. Verse 9, the enemy has said, I will pursue, I will overtake, I will divide the spoil. My lust shall gorge on them. I will draw my sword. My hand will destroy them. Again, that's not just Pharaoh's attitude, is it? That's Satan's attitude. This is a whole new level of crazy, but it perfectly describes Satan and what he is going to do when his day of defeat and judgment draws near. It says that back in Revelation chapter 12. Woe to the earth and the sea, for the devil has come down to you with great rage. And why is he so enraged? Knowing that his time is short. All right? Verse 17 says something similar. So the dragon also, again, became enraged at the woman and went off to make war with the rest of her offspring, those who keep the commandments of God and hold to the testimony of Yeshua. So as he knows that his time is short, he goes into a greater and greater rage, and he targets certain people, most of all. We all, of course, the woman is understood to be Israel, who through her gave birth to the Messiah. But notice how it says her children are, her offspring, the rest of her offspring, are those who keep the commandments of God and hold to the testimony of Yeshua. Now, you may be on Satan's hit list if you hold to the testimony of Yeshua. Right? Some of the commandments, like most of us that have grown up doing, we've grown up with most of them, but we've never really had a sense of, I need to obey all of them. We have talked ourselves out of a few of them here and there, right? Y'all know what I'm talking about? Or you may be also on his hit list if you keep the commandments and you try to live by the Torah like the Jewish people. But if you really want to be on Satan's enemies list, you be someone who strives to live by both of those truths. You keep his commandments, you keep his Torah, and you hold to the testimony of Yeshua. That's what he really does not want to see in the people of God. He really wants to come after those kind of people. He will be enraged and making war against you. It's not going to be, these times are not going to be your best life now, thanks to Joel Osteen. Right? If Satan has his way, it's not going to be anything like that at all. These are people of faith, and they are being attacked. But the Song of Moses, that's supposed to be sung and read in the times of the end, in the book of Revelation, also reveals not only what happens to Pharaoh, but also to our enemy as he comes against God. Remember, it says that Adonai is a warrior. Adonai is his name. Pharaoh's chariots and his army he has hurled into the sea, and his chosen captains have sunk into the sea of reeds. The deep covers them, and they sank to the depths like a stone. So all of Pharaoh's might and power that he trusts in were cast aside like a toy. He hurled into the sea and covered up. Interestingly, a similar moment happens in the book of Revelation at the judgment of Babylon. Chapter 18, verse 20, he says, "Rejoice over her, O heaven, and you, Kedoshim, you saints, you holy ones, emissaries and prophets, for God has judged her condemnation of you. Because Babylon and such has come against you, this judgment is coming upon her." It says, "Then a mighty angel picked up a stone, like a great millstone, and threw it into the sea, saying, So shall Babylon, the great city, be thrown down with violence. And just like Pharaoh's men, you'll never see them again. Guess what? These are never to be found again." You seeing a parallel? And what's interesting also is Babylon essentially has a millstone tied around it and cast into the sea, which Yeshua states what about happening with the millstone? Matthew chapter 8, verse 6. And I like how the NIV has this one phrased. If anyone causes one of these little ones, those who believe in me, to stumble, it would be better for them to have a large millstone hung around their neck and to be drowned in the depths of the sea. Are you seeing the pattern? The children are his children by faith. The children are those who keep his commandments and hold to the testimony of Yeshua. Then notice something else. What happens, after Pharaoh and his people have been thrown into and drowned into the sea, look back at the Song of Moses, verse 4. He says, your right hand, Adonai, is glorious in power. Your right hand, Adonai, dashes the enemy to pieces. In the greatness of your excellency, you overthrow those who resist you. You send forth your wrath, and it consumes them as stubble. Now tell me, how is stubble and chaff typically consumed? By fire. Chaff and stubble is consumed by fire. And what happens to Satan at the end of the age? Look at chapter 20 in Revelation. When the 1,000 years has ended, Satan will be released from his prison, and he shall come out to deceive the nations at the four corners of the earth, Gog and Magog, to gather them for the battle. Their numbers, again, this is madness that he thinks that he's going to be successful. But their numbers are like the sand of the sea. And they came up on the broad plain of the earth and surrounded the camp of the Kedoshim, the holy ones, the saints, and the beloved city, which is what? Jerusalem. But what happened? Fire fell from heaven and consumed them. And it says, and the devil who deceived them was thrown into the lake of fire and brimstone, where the beast and the false prophet are too, and they shall be tortured day and night forever and ever. The Song of Moses foreshadows all of this. That's why it's sung in Revelation. That's why it's mentioned there. And more, it brings us reassurance. It gives us encouragement, because the Song of Moses reassures its readers of the victory of God over his foes. That's also in the song, verse 13. He says, you, in your loving kindness, led the people you have redeemed. You guided them in your strength to your holy habitation. Terror and dread will fall on them. By the greatness of your arm they become still as stone, till your people cross over. Adonai, till the people whom you purchased cross over. You bring them in and plant them in the mountain of your inheritance, the place, Adonai, that you have made for yourself to dwell in, the sanctuary, Adonai, which your hands have prepared. Adonai will reign forever and ever. That is the reassurance. This is the goal. This is the reassurance for God's people, that he will reign forever and ever. And so if you are reading the Exodus, if you're participating in the Passover, if you're studying the Chag and the cycle of the feast, you're going to be better equipped to understand the times of the end. You're going to have a better equipped to endure the times of tribulation and trouble that are coming. You'll be more reassured to know how it all turns out. We like to joke sometimes, well, I've read the last book and I know how it ends, we win. He's been telling them he reveals the end from the beginning. He's been saying, guys, I win. And he's been telling us in the first book. He's telling us how things are going to end. How can you really be afraid of the enemy that is coming against you when his fate will be no different than that of Pharaoh and his armies? How can you not trust in him to provide for you in times of tribulation? Because he has promised that he will bring us. He'll bring us in. He will plant us at the mountain of his inheritance, the place where he will dwell. Where are the Israelites going? Aren't they first going to Mount Sinai? They're going to the mountain. Then after that, they're supposed to go and find the place where God will tell them where his name is going to dwell. What mountain is that? Mount Moriah. And what city is there? Jerusalem. See, our destination is the same. Our enemy will be defeated. Yeshua's people will be saved, and our future with him will be beautiful. And so we have no need to fear, but instead we wait with expectation for him to be revealed, for his appointed times, for his appointed seasons, when all of these things begin to take place. And the more that we begin to see them take place, the more that we should be anticipating, the more that we should be excited about what is coming, about his kingdom and his purpose, because we are not in the dark, and so we also have hope. That's what it's all for. That's what the feasts are also for, to give us hope, to know where God is taking his people.